everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often those writers are recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, unless it's a Rejoinder episode, which this is. In this episode, we see the triumphant return of Brendan Vidito, who is the author of the Wonderland award-winning collection of body horror stories, Nightmare and Ecstasy, from Clash Books. He also co-edited the Splatterpunk Award-nominated anthology The New Flesh, a literary tribute to David Cronenberg from Weird Punk Books, with Sam Richard. He lives in Ontario, surrounded by books and reptiles. In this episode, we talk about his new collection of short stories entitled Pornography for the End of the World. So if you're at work, headphones, or wait for the car ride home. If you'd like to monetarily support this show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. Patrons are the reason why we have Rejoinder episodes in the first place. You can also throw a one-time donation to me over at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe, or you can buy my book on Amazon. It's called Tired. If you'd like to support the show in a non-monetary way, you can go over to any or all of the podcast playing websites that allow you to rate podcasts, and you can rate this podcast with an honest 5-star rating. Or you can just find me on Twitter, follow me on Twitter, and retweet and share this and other episodes with a friend. Now, without further preamble, here's my conversation with Brendan. I want to make clear for everybody that Pornography for the End of the World is not just a pretty title. This book is what the title promises it will be, and I was very pleased about that, because sometimes in our world we think of very badass titles and we're like, ah, yes, badass title, and then the title kind of does a lot of the work. It's been quite a while since I've read Nightmares and Ecstasy, but it feels like Pornography for the End of the World like really kind of doubles down on what you were doing. If you had to compare the two books in your mind, what do you think, what would you say like makes this new one kind of different?
Yeah, this one is very much an evolution of Nightmares and Ecstasy, but it's also, I really like the idea of collections that are really cohesive. Like the stories kind of all focused around a similar theme. And Nightmares, it was very relationship focused, and obviously there was elements of body horror. This time around, it was more of a kind of a post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic kind of vibe going on. And I guess that makes sense in hindsight because I wrote most of this stuff during the pandemic. So yeah, it was just very reflective of my mind at that time, I guess.
Yeah, something that I admire about the book is how like not mean it feels. Like it's filthy. I say that in the best possible way. Yeah. It's very gory. It's very I don't know, erotic kind of makes it sound like it was intended to be tittillating.
Yeah, no, that wasn't the intention.
And I don't need to tell on anybody here. So, but it's not one for the kids. And but at the same time, like amidst the very dour themes and apocalyptic ideas and kind of hopelessness that pervades, it doesn't feel mean. And that's something that I really kind of like, because I don't know, I also kind of feel like with the title thing, I kind of feel like we fall into the trap of like trying to make something edgy, trying to make something transgressive, and then just kind of like picking a victim or a handful of victims. And I mean, aside from the very real victims within the story, like it doesn't feel like you're pointing fingers necessarily.
Yeah, and that means a lot, because that is something I'm concerned about, like kind of just mean-spirited fiction, because I think that's a trap that you can kind of fall into with body horror sometimes. Yeah, because it's just people are just disposable, and I try to infuse it with as much like kind of emotion and purpose, because I never sit down and so I never really sit down and think like I'm just going to write the most grotesque thing imaginable. It's mostly like I always need sort of any kind of violence or kind of sexual element needs a purpose, and I really like the idea of um, those elements having sort of a rhetorical purpose in the story or an aesthetic one. Uh, so yeah, it's just yeah, it means a lot that it's not that it doesn't come off as mean spirited.
Yeah, the glitterati piece um had like, I mean, really one of the only sort of like, I don't know, hints of like sexual violence or anything, and it was like very clear how you felt about that. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
but otherwise, it's just kind of like, what do we as human animals do when all hope is lost? Because like even in that piece, like the apocalypse has come and the main character's on this like fancy island full of rich spoiled people, and everyone's just like, come on, we're all gonna die anyway because the end of the world's here. There's
yeah,
these supernatural beings that are killing everybody, and it's like, well, yeah, but I mean, like, that would be true without the monsters, without the impending apocalypse. Like, we are all gonna die anyway. Like, that doesn't
yeah.
really give you, carte blanche to be, horrible.
Yeah, because it's just that whole thing was just I find like Marquis de Sade very fascinating and not like in a not in an ironic way. I find there's some things in there that are really because I think a lot of people look at his work at face value, but there's like obviously it's very politically minded and stuff. So I kind of wanted to. That was the fusion of that and like the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing. It just kind of collided in my brain and became this. Yeah, and it's just the whole like almost like the meme where people like it's the end of the world, like let's have an orgy, and the kind of the gross kind of mentality around that, and I just wanted to explore that in a kind of weird, wacky way.
Yeah, I think last time we talked, there was a lot of talk about like comparing your work to Clive Barker and how his um, Hellraiser stuff is very much like limit experience type of stuff. And maybe it's just because I just kind of got through talking to Chris Kelso and David Leo Rice about their David Cronenberg book, but like this one felt more Cronenbergian in places. There's a lot of that sort of like juxtaposition between body horror and like clinical settings or science experimentation stuff, that kind of weaves its way through the more monstery bits that I know that we had also talked last time too about like you were like sick as a kid, and you talked in that recent blog post when you kind of came back to the world about that too. So I guess that makes sense, right? That the Cronenbergian element would be there, especially in this collection.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, I was drawn to his stuff in the first place because of that affinity, I guess. Like body horror just appealed to me on a deeper level because of my experiences with illness. And I think like there was a more kind of a greater openness in pornography for the end of the world about embracing that and just being like, the whole maxim of writing what you know. And I just really kind of drove into that. And I think that's how it kind of I also feel like nightmares, if it kind of very obviously like it wears its inspiration on its sleeve, but I feel like this one it's kind of becoming more of its own thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I think so, because there's other influences too. There's the several pieces that have like stage directions in them, and like film descriptions and stuff like that too. Oh, I found that the Church of the Chronically Ill kind of on that in that same thing, very very fascinating too, because I kept thinking about like, you know, the American folk religion masquerading as Christianity right
yeah,
now, and how there was I don't know if they're still around. They must be. But you don't hear about them very much anymore. There was a church somewhere in the South that like did stuff with rattlesnakes. Like they were
oh yes, I
ostensibly a Christian church, and they did lots of like rattlesnake rituals. until like one of the guys got bitten and died because they're
Yeah.
venomous animals. Um,
Yeah.
and so the idea that like the Church of the Chronically Ill, like it didn't even seem ridiculous to me anymore. You know, like
That is the most grounded out of all of them for sure. And yeah, I just kind of that one really kind of spiraled out of the notion. I forget who told me this. When I was shortly after I was diagnosed, they're like, "Oh, like you're there's a trying to make a correlation between my creativity and the fact that I was sick." And I thought that was kind of messed up. It's like that you need to be suffering to produce art, kind of an extension of that idea. So yeah, I always thought that was kind of odd, and I did incorporate that into the story. I think when he's being inducted into this church, priest or something says like, yeah, like you're a poet, and it's partly having to do with the fact that you're sick. And
yeah, and the like the little elements of questioning your faith in there too, because the main character is like just diagnosed, where there's other people who are, born sick, and so there's like a dividing line in the church, and that I feel like that's one of the shorter pieces too. So it like
oh yeah, that was under 2000, I think.
was it really? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this idea of like I don't know, your brain gets to do an awful lot of work as the reader.
Yeah, I personally love stories like that. So it was just, I feel like that was what it worked perfectly for that length anymore. And it would have probably kind of exhausted that idea. So yeah, the more left to the imagination, the better.
Yeah, that's certainly a skill that I don't feel like I have. I have a really hard time doing short stories. Back a couple of years ago, when I was first starting to get into this scene or whatever you call it, I was writing a lot of flash fiction because I could pump out a story pretty quick. 500 words doesn't take an awful lot of time and doesn't lend itself super easily to like doing a lot of plot. So you can kind of do like these tone poemy sort of like snapshot idea, almost prose poem sort of thing, to the point where I've talked to people a lot recently who like don't quite know or have talked about a debate about like whether or not flash fiction should be considered prose or poetry or its own thing or what it should be. But like the sort of like drill like nature of that makes it feel quite easy to me. But then doing something in between a piece of flash fiction and a book is like really weird to me, because it requires a lot of editing, right? Because you could do 90,000 words on that story. You could do a whole history,
Yeah.
and for me at least, it'd be really tempting to just go after that idea.
Yeah. And I think like, it's funny. I think we're opposites, because I've gotten a lot of, people reading Pornography from the End of the World. And there's a few stories and they're like, I'd love like more from this, like an extension of the work. But I think I've come to a place where I'm just very comfortable with short fiction. I've been writing a novella for quite some time now, and it's just a lot. It's learning an entire new form of storytelling. Um, yeah, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, because yeah, that one, it's even like in between a novel and a short story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, yeah, I find like it's been really challenging, but it's also a great learning experience.
Yeah, I think the idea of trying to write short stories, for me at least, would similarly be that sort of challenging learning experience. What is these days your process for writing like?
Well, for short stories, and I can't really do this. I learned the hard way that this doesn't work for longer works of fiction. But I write my first drafts by hand, and then because it's just easier, because I have a hard time with a strict schedule, so I can like tuck the pages into my pocket and write on the go, squeeze some time in at work or something. But so I'll write the first draft by hand, do a edit as I go, then I'll type it out and do another edit as I'm typing it, and then do another pass. And generally, like that's the final form of the story. And I made the mistake of doing that with the novella.
Mm.
So like having to type, 100, like over close to 200 pages of handwritten stuff, and my handwriting is pretty atrocious. So
Mm.
it's not a very lucrative approach.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing to me how many people I talk to who still do any writing longhand. I recently tried to start like writing in a little notebook. I found one of those little tiny moleskin pocket-sized
Oh, those are
notebooks
awesome.
in
Yeah.
in my china cabinet from a long time ago, and I was like, I'm gonna do this when I'm out instead of like looking at my phone or something. And I think that lasted about a day. Um, like back in high school when I still had a phone that I had buttons to push when I wanted to text, it was a lot easier. Well, and especially in high school too, because you back in the teens, you could take your phone out at school and be in trouble right away, and that doesn't seem to be the case
Yeah,
anymore.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so it was easy to get to class with 5 minutes to go and whip out a little notebook and just sort of sketch ideas down. Um, so I mean, good for you for trying, but
Yeah.
but I don't
Yeah,
blame you
yeah,
for doing or for realizing before it was too late that that's gonna be different.
yeah,
Um,
actually it was one of the I think it was the first draft of that novella. It's for I'm working on it for Clash Books, and Christoph, one of the publishers, he'd asked, he's like, "Hey, can you send it to me by like this date?" And then that's when I realized, I'm like, "Oh shit, this is not even typed yet." And that
mm,
was the moment where it just like, this is not gonna work.
um, I kind of want to backtrack here a little bit. You were talking about being drawn to body horror from like the illness angle. And I think kind of by virtue of the people I've been hanging out with online, I've been seeing body horror primarily as like a queer thing. Um,
Hmm.
you know, the the body horror of like gender dysphoria and all the medical stuff that goes with that. Like it seems to me, especially after the new Cronenberg movie came out, that I feel like it resonated with a lot of trans people, at least as far as I could tell, not being one
Yeah,
myself.
absolutely.
That so like it's interesting to me to see it um, from your angle, but also like really feel how it kind of like intersects. So many of these stories where people get like turned into inhuman creatures through the pursuit of sexual pleasure like doesn't feel all that different. So it's kind of like this all roads lead to mush creatures sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's the cool thing about just the fact that, horror is really opening up to different, like all these like various writers from different backgrounds are contributing, and just showing like the flexibility of just body horror on its own. Um, yeah, because like I think it's come even like just in the last like 30 years, body horror as a genre has significantly evolved. Just in terms of like the topic is it can explore and like how versatile it can be, and yeah, and I think like just for me, it's very personal. So I just take from what I know, and that's how I approach my fiction. But
Sure. Do you think? Do you? I don't know. Maybe your like fingers closer to the pulse of like indie horror lit than me. Do you like see any new currents coming up in horror, kind of in general, or body horror more specifically?
well, yeah, I think like that element, kind of the transgender element in body horror is pretty huge, and it's like there's some great work coming out of that. Yeah, that's one that's I think like that's really kind of taking off, and uh, yeah, and it's just really becoming embraced by different, like even different cultural approaches to body horror tend to be very different than what I think a lot of people are just used to in terms of like Western depictions of it. Um, so yeah, I feel like yeah, it's really kind of like spreading out and growing, like yeah, like some sort of mass.
Good. I'm glad that the best way to explain body horror at all is
Through
through
body
body
horror
horror
metaphors.
language.
Yeah.
You talked earlier about um, these collections, your two collections, sort of like having a through line within themselves, and certainly from the cover to the text, the idea of like worms um, is in many, if not all, of the stories, um, which is cool. Like, I'm a big fan of worms. I think worms are pretty cool, like as an idea, right? Like the idea that they just kind of
Yeah.
like decompose things and are kind of mindless. Um, but yeah, like talk about that sort of element a little bit.
Well, it's funny you say that because like I don't know if I'm just out of touch with my own work to some
Mm,
degree because like I only realize in hindsight I'm like, oh man, like yeah, I write too much about worms. But I think it's just like for me, it's like they hold sort of like and they encapsulate the themes of most of the stories, which is that kind of simultaneous repulsion and attraction. Um, so they're just a symbol, like a symbolic reference for that interplay. Uh, yeah, because I don't know, like they're kind of they're kind of nasty, but there's something like really fascinating about them, and they're very alien. Um, so I just I think they're more of a symbol than anything else.
I see. I like that idea too. That like you kind of only realize certain things about your writing after you've written them. So like, what about this collection was definitely intentional? And then what other things have you realized about it?
The one thing that was more kind of like considered than was the kind of apocalyptic vibe, because most of the stories do have that kind of either if it's not the immediate thing, there's like kind of a lot of rumblings in the background, like characters checking their phones, and there's like shit going on in the world and stuff. So um, yeah, that was one thing that I very consciously wanted to represent in these stories. But yeah, I don't think enough time has passed. Like it's still
Mm.
like it's all been a blur. Because yeah, I wasn't I was kind of blindsided by like it seems to be pretty well received. But yeah, I just because I fell off and I'm pretty bad at social media. Like I thought like no one's gonna really give a shit about the book. But yeah, it seems like it's some people are finding something to like in it, so that's really humbling.
I'm really glad to hear that. I think this is my first Weird Punk Books book that I've read. What has your relationship been with that press so far?
Oh, great. Yeah, Sam Richard, the owner of the press. He's one of my best friends, and yeah, it was just really cool to actually be able to work with him. We our first experience, like working relationship, was on the Cronenberg anthology, The New Flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then yeah, I just reached out about putting out a collection, and I had this in the pipeline already. So yeah, he's excellent in his press. Yeah, there's a lot of really great work. A lot of actually, there's a lot of body horror in his catalog, so it was a really good fit.
Good. I know that I've like followed both his personal and the press Twitter account for a long time, but
Mhm.
it's one of those things where there's so many indie press books and indie presses in general that sometimes it's hard to
Yeah, it's hard
um
to keep track of everything. Yeah,
yeah um but yeah, oh yeah, because Eric LaRocha and Joe
yeah,
Koch are on this press too.
yeah. Well, Joe's amazing.
I kind of wanted to just like go down through all of these stories. um
Yeah, let's do it. Haven't done that yet.
so Walking in Ash is kind of like a ghost story, right?
Yeah, yeah. That was arguably, I think, the most personal out of the collection. Because I was like a long term relationship was kind of declining uh, around the time of that writing, and yeah, I was just really fascinated with the idea of like premonitions and how, but I wanted to do it in a more kind of immediate fashion rather than they tend to be kind of sidelined and just more of like a conceptual thing, but to have it actually like stain and affect like his immediate reality, I just really wanted to explore that.
The Chimera session is kind of that, or kind of has that theme too, of like two people trying desperately to rekindle what they once had through this interesting hallucinatory or viscerally real, almost like a reincarnation experience that I don't know, that one almost felt the most hopeful to me of the stories. Like I was kind of like, oh right,
Absolutely,
yeah, they're
yeah.
gonna keep going, they're gonna figure this out, you know.
Yeah, the that one, yeah, it was open ended, and I someone described it as like the weirdest swinging session
Mm-hmm.
imaginable, and I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
um there's a fly on my microphone. Mother's Mark was, I think, maybe like the most guro of the stories. Um,
Yeah, closer to sci-fi kind of. Yeah, girl. Yeah, that was written specifically for Forbidden Futures. 'Cause
hmm.
for that one, you get a visual prompt, and then you're just free to do whatever you want with it. And
Oh, what was the
mine was
prompt?
just it was so the image in the story. It's like this face, like it's two alien beings, like almost faceless things with just mouths, and uh, they're just embracing. And I don't know. I interpreted there was like some sort of aggression on the part of like the male figure, and I just kind of ran with that.
And then Apate's children is the next one. Is that how you'd pronounce that?
Yeah.
Is that a deity that you created, or is that a real?
No, that's a that I actually I think I'm pretty sure it's Greek. She's sort of the patron of like represents those like who are spurned in infidelity and stuff.
Mm.
I don't really spell that out in there, but it's yeah. So I really just it was mostly I think the one thing that I remember very clearly from that one was I saw an image of a child's skull and all its teeth hadn't fallen yet, so they're just kind of collected. I just thought that was just so gnarly, and that kind of informed the creatures in that story.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. Shortly before the kid was born, I was in a group video call, and people were like, "Oh yeah, by the way, don't look up what an infant skull looks like." And babies are born with both sets of teeth in their head already, and
Oh yeah, it's just so bizarre and gross.
like I guess it makes sense, right? Because teeth are bones, basically, and but at the same time, like they're born without kneecaps. Like it seems like
There's something off,
there's a real
yeah.
inefficiency in how the human body develops.
Yeah, and I just love how like I think it just ties into the whole notion of like the uncanny. It's just like when there's too many teeth or too many eyes, it's just instantly wrong.
Mm-hmm. Human clay was a fun one too. That was sort of like um, I don't know, kind of reminded me of like Drive or the Transporter, right? Because it's the um, main character's a transporter of things and messes up, and then this whole sort of interesting emotional roller coaster happens that I think he probably ends up probably least human of the
Yeah, he has
creatures.
probably arguably one of the worst fates of any single character in that collection.
Um, and then I jumped ahead to the Chimera session, and we talked about Church of the Chronically Ill. Oh, the Living Column was an interesting one too.
Yeah.
I want to hear your take on that before I muddy the waters myself.
So that one, um, so it's basically a guy. It's so funny because I'm struggling to remember. Like, there's a few stories that were written in a very condensed period in the middle of the pandemic, and my
Mm,
memory of actually writing them are so foggy. Um, I had to reread. I think it was Mother's Mark on a podcast, and I was like, I
mm,
don't remember writing this. But yeah, it's a guy on a business trip, and he goes to this kind of surreal hotel, uh, and he meets this woman at the bar, and just things kind of get really bizarre, and like reality starts breaking down. But that one was I think the core image for that story was I forget where this hotel was, but it's just it's sort of a hotspot for like urban explorers. It's on a mountaintop in the middle of a jungle, and because of the humidity, there's sort of condensation running down the walls. There these white concrete walls, and it almost looks like blood just running from the balconies and stuff. Uh, and I just kind of went from there. And there's a bit of In the Hills of the Cities by Clive Barker. There's a bit of kind of that's a definite inspiration for that story.
Keeping with my film analogies, it kind of gave me Lost in Translation vibes, like Lost in Translation, but make it very terrible.
I love that. Yeah. Picture Bill Murray in the lead role of it.
just being sort of Venus flytrapped into some sort of weird orgiastic concrete structure.
Yeah.
The glitterati piece. I don't know how to pronounce the second word in that title.
Yeah, Guignol, that's taken from like Grand Guignol, the theater.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the term, I suppose. Is that French then?
It's just basic. Yeah, so it was this movement in France. I guess it's often seen as like the predecessor of gore films, because you would go in these kind of shabby, like out of the way theaters, and people would stage performances like these kind of really just grotesque, like there'd be fake blood flying into the audience, and it was just really lurid plots of women getting murdered, people getting decapitated, or so yeah, it was short lived, and then it died off because I guess when the society was kind of tightening up and it was no longer deemed appropriate, I guess.
I see. Okay, there's some connection based on my cursory Googling right now, that there's like a French puppet show sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the because like the puppet, I think the whole idea of the puppets like just kind of beating each other over the head. I think there is some sort of like ancestry there, but
bizarre.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that I get to keep learning about weird subgenres of genres I'm very into. But that's one of the ones that has the sort of stage directions, at least as like a sort of, I don't know, like a chapter marker sort of thing.
Yeah, and that was deliberately just to kind of mimic the structure of a play, because as far as I know, like the majority of these Grand Guignol performances, like the plays themselves, are just lost media technically. But yeah, I'm assuming obviously there was stage direction and stuff at some point.
Right. And then the last one, Nostalgia Night at the Snuff Palace, is that the longest one?
Oh yeah, that one's close to 10K, I think.
Okay, yeah. And then I don't know. I can't think of a good film analogy for that one. It kind of gave me Jubilee vibes, I guess. in like, I don't know how it made me feel, not necessarily so much plot structure.
Yeah, that one definitely has the piece of media did sort of plant the seed. So a friend of mine grew up in London, and he told me, he visited, and he's like, have you ever seen the movie Threads? And he's like, it's this TV movie that played, I think it was in the late 80s. And I said, no. And he's like, it's the most fucked up thing imaginable. And I was like, I was kind of dubious because it's a TV movie, right? Then I actually sat down and watched it. And this was worst timing to watch this movie. I think it was the war in Ukraine had just broken out, and I was just doom scrolling all the time, and really it's a bad place.
Right.
The film just kind of revolves around, it's set during the latter days of the Cold War in a steel mill town in England, and they get nuked by the Soviets, and it's just sort of like the immediate kind of aftermath of this nuclear detonation, and then it goes 20 years into the future, and just basically shows how this small town has like regressed into the Middle Ages, and it's horrific. I just feel like this movie should be shown to like any politician with it kind of like even remotely close to these nuclear codes as a form of deterrence or something. It's just like horrific, and yeah. So I just wanted to that was sort of the catalyst for I wanted to write some sort of like nuclear Holocaust story, but I did it in a kind of infused it like a surreal angle with added these beings, and I kind of like for the way my ideas work. Uh, I generally start out with two seemingly disparate ideas that kind of come together and then they create a story. So that's why I guess like when I explain these stories, it's difficult to do that because there's so many like different things going on, and that's by design. But I just like things that are like short stories that have like real meat and like just layers and.